confusions, conflations, and equivocations regarding experience, in the sense of experiencings and what's experienced. The Kant-Frege claim is that to think of merely entertaining a representation as something one can do is to fail to appreciate the distinction between judging and what's judged, between force and content. And here I think it's worth backing up a little. The tradition that Kant inherited understood judging as predicating, classifying something particular as being of some general kind, applying a universal concept to a particular one. Although Kant continues to use the traditional language, ultimately derived from this term logic, thereby, I think, distracting attention from the radical break he's making with the tradition at this point, he sees that this will not do. His table of the forms of judgment includes conditional judgments, disjunctive, negative, and most important, modal judgments, none of which kinds is happily assimilated to the predicational classificatory model. The underlying thought, though, I think, is not made fully explicit until Frege. It turns out, we can now see, thanks to Frege, that in the traditional theory, the notion of predication is being asked to do two incompatible jobs. On the one hand, it serves as a structural way of building up new judgeable contents. And on the other hand, it's thought of as a kind of doing that has the significance of endorsing those contents. The collision between these two senses in which predication might be thought of loosely as an operation is clearest when one thinks about judgeable contents appearing as the unasserted, unendorsed components of more complex sentences or judgments. The conditional is a paradigm for Kant as for Frege. When I assert, if P of A, then P of B, I've not asserted P of A. Have I predicated P of A? If so, then predication does not amount to endorsement. Predicating is not, as the tradition had it, judging. But if not, it looks as though there's an equivocation when I detach from the conditional, reasoning, if P of A, then P of B, but P of A, so P of B. For the second premise is a predication, and on this line, the antecedent of the first premise is not a predication. So it looks like there's an equivocation. Geach famously picks up this Kant-Frege point, using it in his masterful gem-like essay, Ascriptivism, to argue against emotivist semantic analyses of terms of moral evaluation. And this is actually the master argument against expressivism that Blackburn has worried about so much. Geach's target is theories that understand the normative significance of terms such as good, not as part of the content of what's said about an act, not as specifying a characteristic that's being attributed, but rather as marking the force of the speech act. Calling something good on this target line is thought of as doing something distinctive, commending, saying boo or hurrah. Geach first asks what the limits of this ploy are. What are the rules of this game? He points to the archaic English verb to macarize, meaning to characterize someone as happy. Does the possibility of understanding calling someone happy as macarizing her mean that happiness is not a property being invoked in specifying the content of the claim that someone's happy? Because in saying that, what we're really doing is doing something else, performing the special speech act of macarizing. But if we can do that with happy, why not with mass or with red? Just what are the rules of this game? What are the limits of the ploy? Geach then suggests the embedding test. Look to see if an expression can be used to construct a judgeable content that's not directly used to perform a speech act. Paradigmatically, put it in the antecedent of a conditional. So, for instance, because imperatival force is grammatically marked, we can't say, if shut the door, then something else. But we certainly can say things like, if he's happy, then I'm glad. Or if that's a good thing to do, then you have reason to do it. And in the first of these, I have not macarized anyone. And in the second, I've not commended any action. It follows that the terms good and happy do contribute to the specification of content and are not to be understood as mere force indicators. I called this essay masterful and gem-like. It's 6 pages long. Geach makes his point, refutes this entire tradition in its classic form, and then gets out. He said what he needs to say. Worrying about compound forms of judgment containing unendorsed judgeable contents as components required Kant to distinguish the operations by which such contents are constructed from the activity of endorsing the results of those operations. After Kant, you really can't think of judgment as predication. You can't use this classificatory model of consciousness anymore, which of course hasn't stopped people from doing it, but only because they didn't appreciate the force of this Kant-Frege point. So for this reason, Kant couldn't take over the traditional classificatory theory of consciousness, which depends on understanding judging as predicating. That was basically the idea that every philosopher before Kant, I want to say, had operated with, some variant of this notion of judgment as predication, a classificatory notion of consciousness. Kant sees that that won't do. He needs a brand new idea. What is it that you're doing when you're judging? And here's where Kant comes up with what's perhaps his deepest and most original idea, the axis around which I see all of his thought as revolving. What distinguishes judging and intentional doing from the activities of non-sapient creatures is not that they involve some special sort of mental processes, but that they're things, but that judgments and actions are things that knowers and agents are in a distinctive way responsible for. Judging and also acting involve commitments. They're endorsements. They're exercises of authority. Responsibility, commitment, endorsement, authority, these are not Kant's words, these are the words I'm using to make his point. They're all normative notions. Judgments and actions make knowers and agents liable to characteristic kinds of normative assessment. His most basic idea is that minded creatures are to be distinguished from unminded ones, not by some matter-of-fact ontological distinction, the presence of mind stuff, but by a normative deontological one. This is his normative characterization of the mental, and it's the result of seeing what was wrong with the old predicational classificatory model of consciousness. Drawing on a jurisprudential tradition that includes Grotius, Pufendorf, and Crusius, Kant talks about norms in the form of rules. Judging and acting, endorsing claims and practical maxims, committing ourselves as to what is or shall be true, is binding ourselves by norms, making ourselves subject to assessment according to rules that articulate the contents of those commitments. And those norms, those rules, he calls concepts. And in a strict sense, all a Kantian subject can do is apply concepts, either theoretically in judging or practically in acting. Discursive, concept-mongering creatures are normative creatures, creatures who live and move and have their being in a normative space. It follows then that for him the most urgent philosophical task is to understand the nature of this normativity, the bindingness, the validity, Verbindlichkeit, Gültigkeit of conceptual norms. This master idea has some of Kant's most characteristic innovations as relatively immediate consequences. The logical tradition that understood judging as predicating did so as part of an order of semantic explanation that starts with concepts or terms, particular and general, and advances on that basis to an understanding of judgments, now we can say in the sense of judgeables, as applications of general to particular terms, and builds on that basis an account of inferences or consequences, construed syllogistically in terms of the sort of predication or classification exhibited by the judgeables that appear as its premises and conclusions. In a radical break with this tradition, Kant takes the whole judgment to be the conceptually and explanatorily basic unit at once of meaning, cognition, awareness, and experience. Concepts and their contents are to be understood only in terms of the contribution they make to judgments. Concepts, he says, are functions of judgment. Well, why does he adopt this semantic order of explanation? I think it's because judgments are the minimal units of responsibility, the smallest semantic items that can express commitments. The semantic primacy of the propositional, I'm saying, is a consequence of the central role that Kant accords to the normative significance of our conceptually articulated doings. In Frege, what I think is this very same thought shows up as the claim that judgeable contents are the smallest unit to which pragmatic force can attach, paradigmatically, assertional force. And in the later Wittgenstein, it shows up as the claim that sentences are the smallest linguistic units with which one can make a move in the language game.